Three Mississippis. In 3, 2. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Joan Thomas's novel, Wild Hope. Thank you all so much for joining us. We will kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. We have Free Press literary editor Ben Sigurdson joining us as host. We have Angela Torgerson from McNally Robinson and author Joan Thomas. The stream is coming to you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Angela for an introduction, and then Joan will take it away with a reading, followed by our Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to those when we can. After the discussion today, I will introduce our next pick. And with that, over to you, Angela.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. And thank you once again to Ben and Nadya and the Winnipeg Free Press for gathering us all together. I'm very excited to be joining you all and getting the opportunity to discuss one of our favorite books from 2023 here at McNally Robinson. Joan Thomas is an award-winning author of 5 novels, and more to the point, one of our most dynamic and interesting authors that we are so very, very fortunate to have in our local literary community. Pardon me. Each of Joan's novels are completely absorbing, meticulously researched, and complex. The characters she introduces us to are crafted in such a perfectly human, flawed, and true-to-life matter that the reader recognizes them in themselves, their family, their neighborhood, and their community. Part of what makes Joan's books truly, truly riveting is the way that they shed light on so many of the larger issues facing contemporary culture. These books don't shy away from asking the important questions, and this is very much the case with her latest, Wild Hope, the novel we are here to discuss tonight. The novel begins with a mystery, a missing person, but the journey takes the reader so much further than that. Wild Hope puts a spotlight on entitlement and the inequities of wealth. It examines consumerism and the inevitable impacts this has on climate change, set against the backdrop of one of the most breathtaking vistas in the country, and one that exists largely as a playground for only our most wealthy. Wild Hope is full of characters who are very much facing choices and decisions in their lives. And as the story unfolds, we see torment, there is despair, and there is downright villainy. But to quote Joan herself, there is, if also not hope, there is resolve, that we can do better, we can try to be better, to create a better world. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce our author tonight, Joan Thomas.
Oh, Angela, what a lovely introduction, and
what a
thoughtful reading of the book. Really, that was wonderful. Sometimes it's hard for me to talk about my work and to know what it is about, so it's very interesting to hear what you saw in it. Thank you. And I just want to thank both your establishment, McNally's, and Ben, on behalf of the Free Press, for what you do for writers. I posted about this event on Facebook, and I get writers from across the country saying, "Oh, we're so jealous. You guys have so much support for your writing in Winnipeg." And it's true. We're very, very lucky in that regard.
We're very
I'm
lucky.
just going to read you a short passage that is in the point of view, in the voice of a young woman named Isla, who is a chef and running a farm-to-table restaurant north of Toronto, and starting to think about her job and her purpose in a slightly different way. Her boyfriend, Jake, will also come into this passage. He's a visual artist. So if you want to follow on, any of the readers out there, I'm starting on page 111, but I am skipping a little bit as I go along. Something was in the air, some peppery gas that shifted the meaning of everything. One day I was standing by the work table making a tray of smoked trout canapes, and I could hardly go on. I said to myself, It's not like you run a sweatshop where women sew clothes that are going to end up in a landfill after some rich girl wears them twice. It's not like you own a mica mine in India and force starving children to dig glitter for eyeshadow out of the earth. Food is a human need. But then I thought, you never cook for people who are really hungry. It would have been awesome to talk this through with my boyfriend, but we'd entered a new era, Jake and I. A cold cloud had settled over our household, and it refused to move on. We did not act like children or make a fetish of our silence. We talked to each other about domestic matters when the router went down, for example, or if someone needed to pick up milk. But the artless chat that used to fill our days was gone. Silence is not a helpful strategy when distance is the problem, is it? I'd watch out the window as Jake walked towards the house, a little hunched, his face preoccupied, and then he'd step into the kitchen and I'd speak to him and see him flinch, like any bit of attention was an intrusion. He was hypersensitive, as though he was constantly under threat. I believed that he loved me. He just didn't have the bandwidth to interact with me. I thought about the way he'd confided in me when we were first together. Our conversations were more honest and personal than any I'd ever had. But strangely, this hadn't brought us closer. It had made him want to barricade himself from me. I began to be very aware of the skylight of the shed, which you could see from our bedroom window. When I woke up in the night, I'd get up and check whether the light was still on. It always was. If Jake was asleep on the futon, I could have walked across the yard and slipped into the shed and under his quilt, caught him off guard. But given that he was awake, we'd have to contend with the awkwardness between us. And even if lust got us over that hurdle, there would be the afterwards, that cherished time of lying in each other's arms or lying side by side with no need to touch, because the air encasing you is drenched with your love. The way you talk or don't talk in those moments, neither of us could deal with that.
Oh boy. Well, that's a lovely passage to have chosen, Joan. I thank you for reading that for us. And yeah, thank you so much for being here. I know you're not in Winnipeg right now. You're in BC, are you not?
That's right, in Sydney on Vancouver Island.
What are you up to out there?
Well, we're going to have sort of a vacation. We got friends here, and I'm doing some events up island and on Hornby Island.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad you took some time from your vacation to chat with the folks back home. We very much appreciate it, and I've been looking forward to to talking about this book with you again. I talked to you when it first came out, and we had a great conversation about it, and I loved reading it as much, if not more, this time than I did the first time. So, yes, thank you for coming, and maybe do you want to talk a little bit about a little bit first, just about sort of when you started writing the Wild Hope, when the process, what it was like. Sort of, I know it was during the pandemic.
Yeah, after Five Wives, which was historical and based on research set in 1956, I wanted to do another contemporary novel, and I really wanted to take on some of the troubling issues that all of us, I think, are turning our minds to pretty often. And I also, Five Wives had 7 points of view, and I wanted to do something that sort of moved faster and had one point of view. So I conceived, first of all, of this character named Isla, who's a pretty hopeful and psychologically healthy young woman. And I guess I sort of thought I wanted to create a character who has the best chance to figure things out. And that's how Isla came to be. And it has a job that is creative plus, sort of for the common good. Her whole life appealed to me, the way her parents raised her sense of self-confidence, her sense of self. And then I had her in place, and then I thought about, as a counterpoint, having her fall in love with somebody who did not have the privilege of parents who sort of affirmed his sense of self when he was growing up, who was a bit more troubled and who took on the issues of the present day with sort of fewer resources for dealing with them, I think. So I thought I would put those two characters into a plot that would challenge them and ask them not just to deal with each other, but to deal with the way the world is changing.
Yeah, and I mean, one character that has not come up as of yet really is Reg, a longtime friend of Jake's, and sort of struggling in a very different way, I feel like, with some of the issues that Jake is struggling with. Sort of fatherhood issues, and at one point Jake says to Kurt, another character in the story that we can maybe get into or not, that he is sort of quote, afraid of his own anger and unresolved issues of anger and rage, particularly in these male characters of Reg and Jake, sort of seem to permeate through the book, and both have had strained relationships with their fathers. I guess, what was it like sort of parsing those two parallel and also intersecting stories out for you?
Yeah, well, I really wanted to tease out the components of capitalism, the competition that is at the root of it, and sort of look at the fact that probably this competition in our public sphere has also its manifestation in our relationships. And, I think maybe it sounds sort of audacious for me as a woman to be looking at it, but I am interested in that indoctrination for men, the way that men are so trained to see their self-worth in competing successfully. I mean, we're all struggling to change as a society, but I think our change is only going to be affected if we really go back to some pretty fundamental indoctrination as children. So I was trying to look at that. Reg has sort of drunk the capitalist Kool-Aid. I mean, he's just determined to rake in as much money as fast as he can. He wants to be part of the 1%, whereas Jake is questioning the whole thing. And it's sort of interesting that they both have the same father figure in a sense, because Reg becomes Jake's father's sort of honorary son. He's more, his ambitions are more in keeping with what Jake's father hoped for with his son.
Yeah, no, that's it comes through very, very strong, and obviously Reg with his own troubled family background, and the way in which he sort of troubles Jake's family relationship as well, and the ways in which Jake's father and Jake and his mother and everyone sort of complicate this relationship. It's just such a fascinating aspect of the book. I'm trying to think, one of Jake talks and thinks a lot about art and about sort of the ways in which he struggles with the world and his own art. In one of the chapters, you write about how he's almost overcome at what he sees, that the world sort of, quote, would come to him so intensely he'd almost think he'd had a seizure, end quote. Like, it's just such an overwhelming feeling of beauty in the natural world. Is that something that you've sort of experienced in your own making of art, in your own writing of fiction, that you see or hear, experience something that sort of takes you to a different place?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about
question.
You're talking about both our the way we experience nature and the way we experience art, and I would say yes to both. Especially when I was younger, I think I was tapping into experiences I had out in the hills, the Carberry Hills, where I grew up, that really felt deeply spiritual or made me feel really alive. And part of what we're dealing with now in the contemporary world is that fracturing of that relationship with nature that allows us to see nature as, just a repository of minerals or a place where we can prop up our industry. And Jake moves back into wanting to drill down and paint what he sees in nature, because he sees it as a way of healing that breach. That's the way that art can change the discourse and move us more towards a whole connection with nature.
Okay, so I had there's a question from a reader, Sylvia, who says on page 25, there's a description of Jake's painting of the marine biologist and nature writer Rachel Carson. Is there a particular artist or artistic style that you had in mind when writing this image?
Yeah, I talk about the fact that it seems impressionistic, except for the very details of, say, the faces of the figures that he's creating. I'm not sure if there's one particular artist that I had in mind when I wrote that, to be honest.
I had forgotten actually until I reread the book that about the painting that Jake had done in the cabin, and just about the picture of Isla that he had done when she had stolen or taken from the lodge. I thought that was so striking, and reading it back the second time, it was great. It's not a question, I know. Angela, do you have a question you'd like to jump in
So like getting back to Jake, like he seems to really desire and have this drive and need for change. He needs to see the world sort of come together in a place that makes sense to him. But because of his father, he has such distrust, um and he sees that reflected back from Reg. How did you find, like, to me, saying this wrong, to me, Jake really read as hopeful, but very distrustful of there being hope for change. Is that, like, did you see him as a catalyst for change, or did you see him sort of frustrated with a lack of change?
I saw him as wanting to give it his best shot, but getting kind of re-ensnared
Yeah.
when Reg came along. Like I'm very interested in the fact that we as a civilization theoretically see the need for change, and yet feel so unable to bring change about. We want to change the world, but we have trouble changing ourselves. And I'm sort of interested in the way our own personal psychological grievances and needs will often predominate over larger social actions. We seem to expend most of our energy in trying to look after the things that are wrong with ourselves. And I think that in a sense that happened with Jake. He's more sophisticated in his thinking than Isla, but he's also more easily bogged down in the pain of the past and an inability to move forward.
Right. Isla seemed so much more hopeful that she could set a goal and move forward with it. And one of the ways I thought that was best described for me was in each of the main characters' interactions with Quinn. Jake wanted to throw himself into that relationship and fix Quinn's lot in life, to put it mildly. Whereas Isla wanted to see Quinn take charge of her own life and was frustrated by the lack of that. Is that sort of the point of Quinn as a character? How did you see her fitting into that community?
Yeah, I saw her as an agent of disturbing the status quo in a way. I mean, she sort of forces people to question the way they're operating. She casts that very luxurious restaurant in a different light when she starts panhandling and even begging inside the dining room, asking for food. I've had that experience when I was in Ecuador, of people who would come right into a restaurant up to your table and ask for food. And it really shakes the way you see yourself as a diner at that table. And so I saw Quinn in that way. Yeah. I mean, I think Isla also sees her in a fairly positive light at the end when she's pregnant there. Isla says, you know, you're a strong person, you're going to make it through this. But Quinn certainly doesn't conform to the sorts of social conventions that Jake was raised in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and at one point, Isla says, while looking at Jake's notebook, maybe that's a dilemma he was wrestling with, how to portray loss and terror when your whole aesthetic tends towards beauty. So it really is sort of that wrestling with the real world nature of you know, the difficulties of the real world versus the sort of the striving for beauty and for perfection in art or whatever, which I thought was just such an interesting contrast of ideas.
Yeah, well, I guess I face it particularly in writing, that so many of the conventions of our novels are, it seems to me, don't fit the way the world is changing. You know, the emphasis on the individual and how we're all self-made, and we all have quests that we have to fulfill, and our own success is what matters. I mean, we're looking at an era where those kinds of individual quests are actually counterproductive. They're damaging to society. We need to be looking more at what is good for what is supports the common good. So things like that, the whole notion of man in conflict with nature too. So I guess I didn't want to write about a writer, but in a sense, I used visual art as a bit of an analogy to explore those things.
And then also, I feel like to an extent you use the art, the culinary arts, for lack of a better term, sort of to give that a different perspective, but also still to comment on, you know, notions of capitalism, of climate, and what have you. You know, the sort of the local sort of farm to table stuff, and Isla sort of you know, having more of a local focus on that stuff while feeding these rich people who are coming from Toronto by fancy car or even by helicopter, whereas most locals aren't even able to sort of take part in this excellence, which I remember when we talked before, you mentioned wanting to explore how we define excellence. And you know, sort of when thinking about art, it feels a little bit more nebulous to me as a reader, but when thinking about food, you know, it's sort of the difference between, you know, fast food and, you know, haute cuisine or whatever, and there is a tangible difference there that most people, I think, would be able to unpack. That's,
yeah, I
again,
mean,
not a question. I'm very bad at this.
No, well, I'll just say it's interesting to me that so many of the things we strive for, that we associate with excellence and good ambitions in our lives, are difficult now in the light of the climate crisis, flying around the world. I mean, we used to see somebody who was very well traveled as sort of the epitome of you know, having lived a rich life. Or we're all foodies. We fly exotic ingredients from around the world too. And all of these things have enriched our lives, and they have been how we define our success in many ways. And yet the current moment is asking us to question them. So I'm just kind of interested in that whole question.
Angela?
I was just gonna like to go back to your point about foodies. I liked the comment that you made during your reading about feeding people who were never hungry. Do you think that that's part of the conspicuous consumerism, almost like the performative art of dining out and eating for the Instagram pics, for the sake of eating something, rather than actually enjoying and sitting down with a meal with family and friends that you've made yourself, or you've prepared? Yeah,
I think that's very well put. And in fact, Isla observes that people are often too jaded to really appreciate what she and her partner are serving at the Grange. They don't want to be disappointed. They want every meal to sort of surpass the one they had before. And I often think it's partly because people who societies where there is a large proportion of people who are malnourished. If we saw that, well, I'm questioning even saying this, because we do see poverty around us, but we don't see it probably to the extent that we might see it in a developing country. If we saw it juxtaposed with the kind of meal that we're eating, we would probably question it. I mean, it's very hard to write about this without sounding moralistic.
Oh yes,
but I'm trying to figure it out for myself,
I did find a question. Oh yes, okay. So this sort of ties in with a question that I had, and I was trying to figure out how to phrase it, so I'll probably screw it up when I try and read it. But I mean, so the River Trail of the Forks opened 5 days ago. Mm-hmm. It's now closed because temperatures are so wildly odd this year that it's too warm. Outdoor rinks are shutting down, blah blah blah. Raw Almond, which is a sort of very fancy, $300 a plate event that usually happens on the ice at the river where the junction of the Red and Assiniboine is, had to be moved onto land or whatever for the second time, I think, ever, because there was so much uncertainty about the river ice and stuff like that. And I guess, yeah, you mentioned this difficulty before of writing a novel that's moral without being moralistic. I guess my question is there a worry maybe you weren't moralistic enough? It's a weird question. I mean, I was thinking about things, and I was like, started writing this big diatribe, and I was like, I need a question at the end of this.
Yeah,
that's what I came up with.
I don't know. I mean, I've tried to be subtle in my writing. I don't want to pound people over the head with this sort of thing. I'd rather err on this side of someone enjoying the story and letting the ideas fall as they may into their psyche. So no, I don't sweat not being moralistic enough. I think people who have this mindset, they will read and grasp what the ideas are that I'm working with. And I think it shifts the way we see the world if writers take on these realities. Like in some ways, we don't acknowledge realities often until we see them in our stories.
No, that's true. And I mean, I was using Raw Almond as an example, just sort of in my head. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many parallels between the Grange and Raw Almond, except, the Grange won't sink into the river if you put it on the ice or whatever. I'm going to jump over totally tangentially to a reader question. One guest of the book club says, as a reader of Joan's novels, it's evident that she researches various issues sort of connected to different novels. Said, for example, on pages 132, 33, Old Jack refers to the Rocky Mountain Water Diversion Plan. And that was just as an example, but or he, I can't remember. Would you be able to comment sort of on the research that you do for your novels in general, but I guess specifically for Wild Hope? I mean, you would have had to have researched rural Ontario and Toronto art scene, I imagine, and all sorts of different capacity or different aspects.
Yeah. The Rocky Mountain Diversion I read about online during the pandemic. I did most of this. I wrote this book during the pandemic, and so a lot of the research was just done online. I'd never really heard about that project. I found it so interesting the way these engineers were prepared to play God and sort of rearrange all the waterways through North America. But there are some dangers with just doing research based on secondary sources. For example, with Reg's Lodge, I had it on an island until like the second draft of the book or the third draft, because I had never traveled to the Bruce Peninsula. And then finally, when the pandemic restrictions lifted, we did take a trip across Manitoulin Island and down to Tobermory. And then I discovered that the islands that I had seen on a map were all controlled by Parks Canada, and they did not allow any building there. So I had to move it to the mainland.
Yeah.
So I did that one trip to the Bruce Peninsula and down. We drove into southern Ontario and just kind of drove around looking at some of the small towns north of Toronto and trying to figure out where this restaurant would be placed. I think Manitobans might feel a little bit disgruntled that this book didn't take advantage of the natural beauties in Manitoba. But I wanted to do it partly because I just saw Reg as an operator that would be working out of big power center like Toronto. And it's also just fun to use other settings. I really love researching when I'm traveling like that.
I mean, you're going from Five Wives set far, far away to, Wild Hope set much closer. So you're getting closer. You're circling back.
Well, I have written a Winnipeg book, and that was
exactly. No, exactly.
set in Wolseley. So
exactly, you're circling back around again to we can talk about what you're working on next or what you're planning on working on next. Quick question for you, from Shirley from the book club. Did you ever work as a professional cook?
I worked at Salisbury House.
Oh, well, professional
as a short order cook. Does that count?
How long were you there for?
One summer.
Yeah, we'll accept that. All right. But you didn't, it was not very farm to tail, I would imagine.
No.
Here, okay, we'll just jump to another reader question. David asks, why is Isla so hostile to the idea of Reg purchasing the Grange when she clearly has few reasons to keep it, even if she dislikes him almost as much as Jake did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Lets you talk about Reg and Isla a little bit. Fun.
Yeah. Well, it really struck me in the last 4 or 5 years that these tycoons that have so much control over the way we live our lives are often very poorly evolved human beings. And I wanted to portray that in Reg. I mean, we see the politics of somebody like Elon Musk, and it's just kind of appalling to think that we countenance this disproportionate control over our affairs by corporations. And so I wanted to portray that in Reg. He's just kind of a schmuck. But sadly, he has the power to destroy communities through the water that he buys up, for example. So I think if Isla is disgruntled about the thought of him buying the Grange, it's just that she, he actually floats to her the idea that he is preventing the or sort of protecting society against the climate crisis, because if his wealth was proportionately spread over the middle class, people would be spending all of it on cars and roast beef and that sort of thing. So she's upset about his politics, and she doesn't want to see him involved with an enterprise that she had taken some pride in.
Angela, do you got anything you want to jump in with?
I mean, Reg was a great villain, absolute great villain. And when we talk about Jake and Isla in terms of wanting and desiring and being driven for hope, and for change, it seemed to me that you wrote Reg as the polar opposite to that he was devoid of any desire for change. He just wanted to buy into that look at who I think I am attitude. Was he a fun villain to write in a way, or was it chilling?
No, I enjoyed it.
Okay, so here, supplemental question. Have you written many villains before?
Have I? I'm not sure that I really have. I mean, in Five Wives, I was very critical of the missionaries' intrusion into the lives of the Waorani people, but I treated them more empathically, I think, looked at the complexity of the way they thought, whereas I never write from Reg's point of view, and didn't really have any interest in it. For him, the status quo is working, right? He's not questioning it, but yeah, fundamentally not a very happy individual either.
I actually have a question as well. I was trying to flip through and find the passage as we're talking about Reg and thinking about Isla. There is this one part that kind of jumped out at me where she's just like, I think she's like in the tent and she mentions just kind of off the cuff these like poisonous mushrooms. And I guess I was wondering, like, in some alternate ending, does Isla like really feel that revenge? I thought, oh, is she gonna cook up something with these
Yeah,
poisonous mushrooms? What's gonna happen here? And I guess kind of spurring
that's
off
a
of
really
that,
good eye. Yeah.
I was
This-
waiting to see, what maybe what that full story ending like looked like for Isla, whether she would seek out revenge or take the high road. She was so
Mhm.
I don't want to say necessarily hesitant, but it was clear that throughout the novel, the authorities, the police, were kind of being incompetent with
Mhm.
their investigation. Um, and so I was wondering, how does this really end for her? Where does she find peace? Was it
Mhm.
going to be in revenge, or was it going to be coming for full circle in another way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you have any other and potential endings?
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you picked that up. Like this book, the plot of it was very slow at taking shape. And initially, I had a whole other plot level, a woman named Maxine, who was a climate activist. She was living in somebody's garage in Toronto. She was a friend of Isla's, and she came out to Reg's lodge with Isla, and she was just really more far less inhibited and aggressive in the way she wanted to pursue Reg. And so I think, and they had some conversation around things like the poison mushrooms. But when this went to my editor, she just said, there is way too much story here. There's too many characters, too much story. And so I ended up taking Maxine out, but there's still little vestigial references, I suppose, to her thinking in Isla looking at the poison mushrooms. But you're raising a bigger question, of course. Like, is there a resolution for Isla and a sense of hope at the end of the book? And yeah, I hope I think readers will make up their minds about that. Reg probably is going to suffer some legal consequences of what he's done. I mean, the book asks the question, is it easier to get somebody for the death of one person than for destroying the lives of thousands of people? And it probably is. But for Isla, I don't think I laid out a very deliberate and concrete path. But I hope that I open some doors in her thinking, that she probably recognizes that the vision she had of her life might shift. She might move in a different direction. She does have that little vision of maybe keeping the Grange and using it as some kind of a center where, the needs of people are met in a more direct way. So, I just dropped a few of those little breadcrumbs in, I guess.
Well, and I thought it was very touching and probably ties in with this a little bit, where she's talking about how she'll go on without Jake being filled from time to time with wild hope. I mean, I guess often I think about the titles of books and stuff. I know authors don't always pick them, but I thought that was a very sort of touching moment when she's sort of thinking about life without Jake and this wild hope comes up and in the face of such hopelessness, and it did sort of help it feel like she would figure her way out and she would find her way through. It wouldn't always be easy and it wouldn't always be happy times, but it would be possible.
Yeah, because she is essentially quite a healthy person. I think when you write a book about an issue as grave as the climate emergency, there is a real temptation to do something, apocalyptic or to scare everybody. And in fact, the more I read about the climate crisis, the more energized I am because I see so many people who are bringing such astonishing resources and such creativity and such energy and optimism to the subject. Young people, especially, who are doing that. And I hope that the title alludes to that a little bit too, that I think that it's nuts to say we can't shift, we can't change, because then certainly we won't. And there's lots of reason to see hope too.
Angela?
Actually, that sort of summed up my exact takeaway from the book, was that there was so much. I loved what you said about resolve, how we had to resolve to act for change, that we had to hope for the best, but really resolve to take steps. And you do see that in the young people. And I think Isla was a really well developed and exciting character to read, in that sense that she would be okay and she would keep thinking about these things. So just thank you, really, Joan. I really enjoyed reading her. I really enjoyed reading all the characters.
Yeah, so did I. I
Yeah.
thought I loved Isla. I just thought she was great. What was it like to write characters from a different generation from yourself? Let's just you know, I mean, I know you've done it before, and you know, even in Five Wives and what have you, you know, younger characters and stuff, but just sort of in a more contemporary setting. Do you enjoy that?
Yeah.
And that would involve some research as well.
I suppose.
Like a little, like just in terms of how people talk, and you know, like I have 2 teenage kids, and I don't know how they. I mean, I don't.
Yeah. I mean, I have a daughter the age of Isla and Jake, and I guess she read this in an early draft, and she sort of raised a couple of points and said, "Yeah, I'm not sure they'd be saying this." But I don't know, it interests me to write about that generation, because I think that's where the greatest hope lies. So yeah.
No, and it's like I sorry, I didn't mean that to come across in any way that like it felt like you were there with them, and it felt so wonderfully natural, and it was fantastic. So I know we did have one question from a reader asking what you were working on next. I know when I talked to you around the time this book came out, you said after Five Wives you wanted to do a contemporary story. And given the conversation we had, where you really sort of talked a lot about the urgency of our current moment, and what we're going through in terms, you know, and what the world is going through and how it's changing in terms of climate, in terms of capital, in terms of all that kind of stuff. Are you inclined, even if you don't want to say anything more about it, because I know a lot of times it's like, it's not really a jinx, but it's like, you know, someone says, "Oh, I'm working on this," and then you talk to them 2 years later, and it's like, no, that never happened. But you know, I know, are you inclined to stick to the present or the near present for now?
You know, I have started something. Usually I will talk in very general terms about what I'm working on. I'm not that superstitious about it. I'll say it's a contemporary novel or whatever. This time, what I'm doing feels so different, and I've drafted about 100 pages, and I don't think any of it is going to ever see the light of day. So
this is exactly what everyone said. Oh yeah, it's 100 pages. It's in my bedside table. It's, you know, I'll never pull it out again.
I sort of feel that way. So I think probably I'll just say I'm working on something that's quite different and tinkering at it, and I don't know for sure if that's what I'm going to end up putting the next 3 years into or not. So
Wow.
I better not say.
No. And it's totally prerogative to say or not say, but I love this book. I mean, I love Five Wives. I loved your previous work as well, but this one really was just it was just one you could really sort of, I mean, Five Wives had a lot of layers and a lot of different narrators and stuff. This one I found to be just, you dove in, you could just devour it, and like at a fine main course at a farm to table restaurant in rural Ontario. But I really enjoyed it. And how are we doing on time? We're sort of just about at the time when we should be wrapping up.
Yeah, we're pretty well wrapping up. So any lingering thoughts that anyone has before I come to our closing remarks?
Well, I would just like to thank all the people that are listening out there somewhere too. didn't see you through this process, but I'm very grateful for your interest in the book and that you took part in this.
Well, I
And
mean,
yeah,
it did pop back up on the McNally bestseller charts for many
yes,
weeks in a row, as I saw. So
right.
obviously there's lots of interest out there because yeah, it's
And
yeah,
the Free Press, all of those ads they run for these books is pretty amazing. It's wonderful.
they're quite large. Sometimes you
People
wonder if
get
we can't
really
get it.
excited about it though. We hear people talk on the floor when they're picking up the book, and especially there are certain books that we see garner more excitement and enthusiasm. And there was a lot of people in the store buzzing and talking about tonight, and listening to you talk again
Oh,
in some
great.
about this book. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all the kind things you said about it too. That means a lot to me.
Easy to do when it's such a fantastic book. So thank you so much for joining us, Joan, from British Columbia. It was just fantastic. So
Thanks so much. See you again with the next book.
yes, absolutely. You'll be our first time visitor.
Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and thank you to everyone on our panel tonight for the fantastic discussion. Next month, we will be welcoming local author Matthew Tetreault to our book club for his novel, Hold Your Tongue. Our next meeting will take place right here on our YouTube channel on February 27th. Our meeting will feature Matthew Tetreault along with Free Press columnist Rebecca Chambers and our friends from McNally Robinson. We appreciate everyone who tuned in with us tonight, and we thank you so much for reading along. We hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.